So with that, I'm going to now introduce Nick Nigro and James D. Filippo. They are both with Atlas Public Policy, and they're going to tell us more about this great analysis that they've just done that shows how we can accelerate the transition of our federal fleet and why it's so important to do right now. So Nick and James, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Ben. And it's great to be here, and I really appreciate the inspirational words of the Congresswoman. Before I get into the findings of our report, I just want to build off what both you and the Congresswoman were saying about the timing of federal fleet electrification. And I would say, in a nutshell, you mentioned it's not a question of if, but when. I would say that our findings from our analysis indicate the timing is now. And so we're going to walk through the presentation we have put together on fleet electrification. And before I do it, though, I want to tell folks a little bit about Atlas Public Policy. We are a small for-profit company based in Washington, D.C. We work with public agencies, governments at all levels. We also work with a number of nonprofits, including Electrification Coalition here, Ben's team, and foundations, along with some private businesses. Our mission is focused on bringing data to the policymaking process. We do a lot of work in transportation electrification, building tools, running numbers, and providing strategic advice to our customers. So with the presentation today, I'm going to first give an overview of our methods and some of our assumptions that we took into running the numbers. And then James is going to share all of the results. As Ben had mentioned, total cost of ownership earlier, that was really the focus of the analysis. That's how we looked at making sense of whether or not EVs were a practical choice for federal fleets. And we also looked at the potential for emissions benefits from a transition to electric vehicles. So those are both a part of the core part of the analysis. In terms of the scope, we looked at passenger vehicles, light duty vehicles, and buses. We did not include trucks, medium and heavy duty trucks that are operating in the federal fleet, in part because there's kind of a lack of good data on what kind of trucks are actually running in those agencies, and more on that in a bit. And then finally, we've talked about the Postal Service a lot already today. They are a very large public-facing fleet. They are also an independent agency who operates differently than other federal agencies. So we pulled the numbers out for the USPS separately. This diagram kind of gives you an overview of like how we looked at our methods or our methodology for running the analysis. We used a tool that we created in partnership with the Electrification Coalition called the Dashboard for Rapid Vehicle Electrification, DRVE. It's an open source tool. It's built in Microsoft Excel. Anybody can go and download it, and it allows you to do vehicle by vehicle fleet analysis, comparing conventional vehicles or gasoline and diesel vehicles with electric alternatives all in one. So it's a very powerful tool, and it was the basis for this analysis. If I could take a quick step back, the inspiration for this project was a project we had completed for the legislature in Washington last year. Basically, what the legislature had asked us to do is conduct an analysis like the diagram we're showing here on all of the publicly owned vehicles in the state of Washington. Kind of a large undertaking, 30,000 plus vehicles of all different types operating in different agencies around the state, being used for different purposes, et cetera. So we gathered all that data and ran the analysis through a version of the DRVE tool and published the results. When we had the opportunity to do the same thing for the federal fleet, we jumped at it. The federal fleet is one of the largest operating fleets in the country. They have a clear public presence in a lot of ways, and the electrification of that fleet is really an opportunity to demonstrate leadership. And so we gathered lots of data on the use of the vehicles, where they're, how many agencies own which type of vehicles. We also looked at the fuel and pricing of those vehicles and emissions factors. And I'll get into some of the sources for that data in a moment. What we were looking at trying to do is figure out at what point does the electrification of this fleet make sense. And so recognizing we're in 2021 now, we looked at data from the Vehicle Technologies Office of the Department of Energy, their forecast for pricing on vehicles at 2025 and at 2030. And those are the different stop points we looked at for running the numbers and seeing at what does the total cost of ownership look like for the gasoline and diesel vehicles that are operating in the federal fleet today, and electric alternatives. So before I turn it over to James to show you the results and give you our findings, I wanted to just talk briefly about some of the key inputs because it's a big undertaking, as you can imagine, collecting lots of data, and we want to make sure that people understand that we were trying to take, to the greatest extent possible, an open source approach. So the DRVE tool I mentioned, that's open source. We'll soon be publishing a dashboard that gives you the detailed scenarios, all the essential scenarios of the vehicles that we ran. And then our final published report is available online. But these are some of the key factors, and I wanted to just spotlight real quick before we get into the results. Thank you to the General Service Administrations for the Federal Fleet Report. That was a great input into our analysis to figure out what kind of vehicles are out there by agency type. We also relied on the Office of Inspector General report from the Postal Service for the inventory of postal vehicles. We relied on similar reports from GSA and others throughout the federal government for other attributes of the vehicles, including acquisition costs, mileage, fuel economy, et cetera. It's all detailed in the table that's shown here. One other thing I want to highlight is an assumption that we made was the social cost of carbon is included in this analysis. We used the social cost of carbon from the Biden administration that was recently published, and that was included as part of the TCO analysis. And last but not least, charging strategy. Lots of different ways to charge an electric vehicle at your home, at your work, and in public. We had to think about what would make sense from a federal fleet perspective. So given the mileage that we had for the vehicles from the inventories, we chose a few different, what we call ratios of vehicles to charging stations for the passenger vehicles in the buses, and ran various scenarios there to accumulate our results and deliver our findings.